Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Activist Lawyer. I am here in the studio with Pádraig Ó Muirigh. Thank you, Pádraig, for joining us.
No problem, glad to be here.
Of Ó Muirigh Solicitors. So we are going to talk about, there's quite a few issues that we're going to cover today. But firstly, just to give listeners a brief introduction about your experience. So you're an experienced legal practitioner specialising in inquest law, legacy inquiries, actions against the police, human rights law, judicial review, criminal law and strategic litigation. So you're currently involved in some high-profile campaigns relating to the Ballymurphy massacre, the Spring Hill massacre and Kelly's Bar bombing. You successfully applied to the local Attorney General to have inquests reopened into a number of legacy cases, including the deaths of the 10 people shot dead by the British Army in Ballymurphy in 1971. Pádraig has acted for a number of families in legacy inquests, and on each occasion the coroner has found that the force used by the state agents in the circumstances of the death of their loved ones was unjustified. He's also issued civil proceedings against the Ministry of Defence and the British Government on behalf of hundreds of former internees in relation to the legality of internment and their ill treatment. He's actively involved in the progressive development of law and the promotion of equality and social justice outside the courts. So Pádraig, you've been an advisor to members of the Assembly and Policing Board on issues relating to legacy investigations and policing and justice policy. He's also been experienced in providing assistance to negotiations related to the Colombian peace process held in Havana, Cuba. And you support the work of Inquest and is a member of the Inquest Lawyers Group and Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. So thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you here in our studio. So I think it's difficult for me. It's been difficult to pinpoint key aspects of your work because I suppose your career to date has been so vast and so encompassing in terms of the different cases that you've worked on. But we'll touch a little bit on your career journey today and I suppose what inspired you to get into law, specifically this type of practice. I know it's quite intense and we have had lawyers on, I suppose, doing similar areas of practice as you. So I think everybody comes with a different angle and hopefully then you can share some advice with our listeners and some aspiring activist lawyers as well. So just firstly, going back, what got you into this area and can you give us a little bit of an insight into your legal career?
Well, when I was growing up, lawyers were spoken of warmly in our household. My father's a former political prisoner during the conflict, and other relatives as well. And I grew up in the Clonard area of West Belfast on an interface, the peace wall which straddles Bombay Street, Cooper Street, very close to that. So I would have grown up with lawyers being talked about at home. My mother and my grandmother would have been going up to the jail. I'd have been going myself. They'd have been visiting with lawyers, and they often spoke about Pat Finucane, PJ McGrory. Yeah. Later on, Rosemary Nelson as well. So these people, this was an honourable profession. I was encouraged to look at a career in law. I was pushed in that direction, but it wasn't difficult because, it wouldn't be an underestimation to say that some of the people I've mentioned there, like Pat and Rosemary and PJ, were heroes of mine. Yeah. They were doing this job at a very difficult time, at a very dangerous time, much more dangerous than I'm doing it. And some of them lost their lives, obviously, doing that as well. The law was used by the state as a tool to deny human rights abuses, but they took a very different approach. They used the domestic courts, but also the international courts, and went to Europe. And we had cases like the McCann case, and a number of other cases from this jurisdiction, which were very important in the development of the jurisprudence of human rights at the European courts. So, I mean, I was growing up and was influenced by that. And, I was often told by my parents, grandparents, that the law could be used to assist your community. And we had examples of that. And we had local great advocates, fearless advocates. And it wasn't too difficult to be inspired by that. So that's really why I became interested and inspired to do law at that particular time.
And I know just from reading a little bit up about your career, you had a great push from your family as well. In particular, one member of your family, your granny, I think, was keen for you to get involved in law.
That's right. I mean, I really had no choice if I think back about it, because that was even before I really grasped the concepts of law and the principles of law. She often told me, "You're going to be a lawyer." And she was a great fan of Michael Mansfield QC, and I remember in particular reading one of the broadsheets and at my grandparents' house, and there was this article about this Tory. His parents were Tories, and he came from that sort of background, and I think he grew up in Margaret Thatcher's constituency, and like the envelopes that were put through people's doors campaigning for during some of her election campaigns. And he obviously went on to explain how he then became involved in a lot of social justice work and human rights work. And I remember that quite clearly. And Michael was someone that she had, a great interest in, and was interested in his work. So, yeah, and I remember thinking, if I do this, I'll maybe bring Michael Mansfield to Clonard, and eventually I was able to do that. So, yeah, absolutely.
Did he meet your granny?
He did, yes. The first time, when I called him to do the Ballymurphy case, I knew that he'd be aware of it. Obviously, it was touched upon at the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which he was involved in.
That's right. Yeah.
And I'd called him. I got an email address and said, "Listen, could you take a call? I'm interested in working with you on a particular case." And we'd arranged the time. I think it was on a Sunday evening, straight after a Gaelic football game I was playing. And I remember running off the pitch, getting changed, and going out into the car park and making this call to Michael. And I'd mentioned Ballymurphy case, and he said, "Absolutely no problem. Yeah, I'm interested." And I said to him, "Well, there's one condition." And there was a silence, and I'm sure Michael on the other end was saying, "Who is this young upstart lawyer giving me conditions?" And after a brief silence, I said to him, "If you take this case, you must come to Clonard and meet my grandmother."
Wow.
And he said he would. So the first time that he came to Belfast to consult with the Ballymurphy families, I think we had a site visit as well. Yeah. On the way back to the airport, I said, "Now, you'll have to fulfil that condition." And he said, "What condition?" He'd forgot about it. And he says, "You're going to have to come to Clonard and have a cup of tea with my grandmother." So I phoned the grandmother and says, "Right, put the kettle on, I have a visitor." I didn't tell her who it was. So when Michael walked in, he sat on the settee with her, held her hand, and they chatted about old legal cases and his career. So, yeah, no, that was
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I'd say she was super proud as well that, not only did you become a lawyer at that stage, but you had Michael Mansfield there as your...
Yeah, it was a nice touch to bring him
Yeah.
there. And Michael Mansfield, I'm sure it's someone you might have on your podcast at some time. Is a great human person.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I wanted him in the Ballymurphy case. Aside from his very obvious legal skills, he's someone who I knew would connect with the families, and that's very important to me. Any counsel that we've used, or lawyers from the office that engage with these legacy cases, they have to understand the families and have a sympathy with the type of cases and have a certain way of dealing with people, and he was very confident. And I have to say the rest of the legal team in Ballymurphy as well, we deliberately pick people like that. But Michael was glad to be in Clonard. He got a visit to Clonard.
Absolutely. So really your family and I suppose your community helped shape your career at the beginning, and then your law practice was established in 2011.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
With, I could see just the vision of it is about creating a legal firm with a radical edge that would fight injustice. So tell us how your practice came to be, and what inspired you to set up by yourself.
Well, I started as a paralegal. It was known then as Kevin R. Winter Solicitors, and now known as KRW Law. And it's several years of paralegal, and obviously then qualified. And after, I think, 2 years, I left and set up my own practice. I'd always wanted to have a practice in my own community, and fortunately, a property became available on the Springfield Road, which was literally only a few doors away from my parents' home. And I leased the property there, and eventually was lucky again in that the doctor's surgery facing it, that building became available, and whenever we started to outgrow our initial building, so we moved directly across the road and remain on the Springfield Road.
Wow, brilliant. I noticed that you provide services in Irish language as well. How did that come about? Is that something that you've been passionate about, and how does that play out in terms of your services to clients?
Well, I grew up in Irish language medium, Bunskull Football First Year. I'm very proud of that. My children have all gone through the Bunskull school, and I think Irish language speakers have a right to go about their daily lives using their native tongue, and they've faced many obstacles, for many decades and much longer, where the language has been discriminated against, almost decimated. So I support and understand the right to do that, and where we can offer services legal services through the Irish language, then we'll do that. You'll note that our website. We try to be as bilingual as we can. I have a number of staff members who have varying degrees of Irish, and I suppose in any CV that I get, it's something that I notice. If someone's an Irish speaker, it's an attractive proposition for people coming to the office as well. And you've seen the recent Act na Gaeilge Anish campaign, which has been fantastic. It's put it right up there, and whilst they've had little success going through the Assembly, hopefully there's another route to that act, and I totally support their right to use the Irish language in the courts on a par with the Welsh Language Act, and obviously the South of Ireland as well. So I'm a great supporter of that.
But it's really something that's crossing all boundaries. I mean, with people from all communities getting involved, whether it's the Irish language, it's taken up GAA sports, and it's great to see, and probably more so in Belfast and areas surrounding you. So it's really having an impact there in a kind of organic, natural.
You have a very vibrant, and I was lucky enough to grow up in this. The Bunskull, when I first started, I suppose it would have been in the late 70s, early 80s, had no government funding. The parents literally week by week get sponsor sheets and kept the school going. And it obviously was very difficult for the parents and the teachers and the Board of Governors and all of that. But we had a real sense of community at that school. I suppose I describe it a wee bit like the community I grew up in as well. With a wee bit of a chip on their shoulder, the world was against you. You felt different. You felt it was a real identity. When we started the Gaelic team in the school, and I was on the first Gaelic team we had, you could see the confusion in the faces of the other students when we played them. We spoke in Irish all the time, and we were very proud of that. We felt a wee bit different, and you can see the progress that has been made since then. There are now many Bunskull, knee skulls. You now have the Manskull. Unfortunately, the Manskull wasn't built when I moved from primary school to secondary school, so I never got to go to the Manskull. But you've seen the growth of the Irish language, a very vibrant, a very progressive community, and something that I'm glad to be part of as well.
Fantastic. I just was looking at, somebody tweeted this week, we'd shared it, I'm in a WhatsApp group with lawyers practicing immigration, and somebody said, being a lawyer is just like getting paid to have anxiety for somebody else. So I know this is a bit of tongue in cheek and people had shared it, but I'm just wondering, I mean, your cases, you mentioned there Ballymurphy. I mean, it must be difficult on a personal level, and we had Dara Mackin on before and other solicitors talking about their work and how close they get with victims and families and survivors. How do you find, that balance, and how do you take that on in terms of the personal?
I don't try and find balance. I'm from that community.
Yeah.
These people are people that many of the Ballymurphy families grew up with my mother and her uncles and aunts. Yeah. My mother's from Ballymurphy. My grandmother was a friend of Joan Connolly, who was shot dead at Ballymurphy. So I don't try to look for a balance. I just I do my job. I'm very proud to do it. Our office is an open door. I mean, very often, when we were in the middle of the inquest, and even the years leading up to it, we'd have had meetings weekly, sometimes more than that. So whenever we had those, the families would walk in straight into the kitchen, put the kettle on. Oh. And that was always the practice that I wanted, where people would feel comfortable. It wasn't a very stuffy, legal, formal setting. So I didn't seek to have some kind of balance or use words like balance. It is what it is. I still have to be professional. I still have to give them advice. That advice has to be objective and the correct advice. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we can't have a relationship. Even some of the families refer to you as their big son, as Mrs. Bonner does, John Laverty's sister, Rita. So you have that kind of relationship where they already knew the family. It didn't take long to get to know them, and whenever we see each other, we ask about how's the children, how's the family. I mean, that's the kind of relationship we have, and I think that's the only way we do it.
Yeah, and despite the fact that I suppose some of the incidents and the cases that you're dealing with occurred 40 plus years ago, there's still that generational trauma, and you can probably see that with the families, as your clients now as well. And I know there was, in inverted commas, good news recently in terms of Ballymurphy, where they were declared entirely innocent, which still just baffles me to this day to see how long that took and how ridiculous that was to get, but at the same time, matters still seem to continue. And I know that currently you're involved in a related matter just about something that really, really affects the families now in terms of the retention of the
human tissue,
and how
and
that's
one
affecting
example,
them.
an organ was retained and destroyed. I mean, that was deeply traumatic for the families. As you say, we had the inquest findings. Families were obviously, after a long campaign, they had legal vindication. They were on a high after that. I know that still brought back a lot of memories, but I mean, certainly there was a sense that they'd achieved something.
Good.
And then this news came out of the blue, that some human tissue samples were retained in relation to 5 deceased, and one example, an organ which was subsequently destroyed without their consent, and we're now dealing with that matter now. So it was deeply regrettable that happened, and we're still waiting on a meeting with State Pathology and the Coroner's Office, which we'll probably do next week, to seek some answers to that or some clarification. But yeah, that's been a difficult moment for them.
So that continues, I suppose, with the families. It's very, very sad. So I know that you're working on a number of court cases, quite high profile cases. Can you update us on how you're...
Yes, I'm currently involved in the inquest of Stephen Gaddis. Stephen Gaddis was a 10-year-old shot dead by the British Army in 1975, just a short distance from our office. And a plastic bullet or baton round was used. So that inquest commenced a number of weeks ago. It has been adjourned until early in the new year. There's outstanding forensic work to be done, and some soldier statements to be taken. So we've that inquest, I suppose, is part heard. We're also involved in recent weeks in relation to some civil litigation arising from Legacy and the Marion Brown case. We've had that case settled, which I can't discuss it too much on a confidential basis. Yeah. So we're still quite busy with other cases, and obviously our practice deals with non-legacy issues, sure, which we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis as well.
Just on that point, and I suppose there's no getting away from this, and I'm sure it really impacted you and your clients as well, the Tory government's recent move to grant immunity from prosecution to former veterans here. I mean, I know a lot of people that we've spoken to here as well have been absolutely incensed by this. How do you see things moving? I mean, that must have been such a blow. Are people willing to challenge that? Is this something that people are going to take further or accept?
Yeah, there's no doubt it will be challenged. I mean, it's clearly incompatible with their domestic and international human rights obligations. I should say, though, that there effectively has been a de facto amnesty during the course of the conflict. You've had, state forces very, very rarely brought before the courts, and even a smaller number convicted in relation to these matters. And I've been involved in a number of inquests, 14 deaths already through inquest, and in all of those cases, it was deemed that force use wasn't justified. So, but these proposals, I suppose, on the back of Ballymurphy are no real surprise. There's been talk about this move for a number of years, but I think it's much more than the amnesty issue. Yeah. They intend to halt inquest and all civil litigation relating to legacy cases, and I think that's much broader. And I don't think that's any great accident coming after the recent assault at Ballymurphy, which got international publicity. And I think what they're trying to do, obviously, is to end judicial activism. There's been a lot of confidence from the communities that I'm working with in relation to the ability of the judiciary to deliver human rights compliant results and the courts, and much more confidence in the justice system than there would have been during the course of a recent conflict. And legal processes are very, very important. I mean, they talk about this alternative of information recovery. That's not going to work. Yeah. Fortunately, people will not get involved in that. Legal processes are vital for a number of reasons. When the truth's been buried, you need to excavate the truth. And how you do that is through disclosure of documentation, the examination of that, using expertise, whether that's forensic, engineering expertise, examining witnesses, and this is very, very important at inquest. It's not just the fact that statements are taken or people are traced, but the opportunity to challenge that their accounts at inquest, and that uniquely happens in a courtroom setting. And what you can do at the other end of that is arrive at findings which hold up, which are evidence-based. Information recovery. And I recently delivered the PJ McGrory lecture in the Field in Football, and I talked about this issue, and I gave an example in Ballymurphy of how information recovery might work as opposed to a legal process. So we had a witness at that inquest called C3, and he came forward after a witness surgery on the Shankill Road, and in his statement he said that Father Mullen, who was shot dead at Ballymurphy, he said that he observed this shooting, and that Father Mullen was wearing robes. He stepped over a fence, and he described this in some detail, lifted his robe. He then walked towards Bobby Clark, who was the first person shot, and Bobby was very seriously injured, but he survived, and he was a very impressive witness at the recent inquest. And he described how this priest then lifted a gun which was nearby and put it up his robe to hide it. So that for me, that's information recovery. It's unchallenged. It's, it arises from a request for information.
Yeah.
It's untested. If we didn't have a legal process like the inquest where this witness could be called, we would have the opportunity to challenge it. And what we had, which the witness may not have known, was that we had the autopsy photographs.
Right.
We had, other witness statements.
Yeah.
And it was very clear that he wasn't wearing a robe. He was wearing black trousers. So the description that he gave, in my opinion, was an attempt to malign the character of the priest. And obviously then would justify why a soldier might have shot at him. So for me, there's a scenario of information recovery versus legal process. And if you don't have the opportunity to challenge information, and I don't call it necessarily evidence, until it's tested, it's not evidence-based, that's the kind of process we can end up with, where families are given information, they don't have an opportunity to challenge it, they don't know if it's accurate, there's no facility potentially to engage forensic experts to view that as well, to have a forensic look at the issues. And the Ballymurphy inquest showed that the legal process is a much more robust forum for doing that. So if we're dealing with even incidents almost 50 years ago, we can still, as best we can, give families the truth. But it's not enough just to provide information. No. And we will end up with false narratives. We will end up with insinuations. Yeah. And false narratives, insinuations are abhorred by the court. They're not tolerated in the courtroom. So I think legal processes have a very important role to play in any truth recovery process.
And do you think cases like Ballymurphy maybe have a greater impact on society as a whole? I mean, in terms of lessons to be learned, not just within the legal context, but particularly for this part of the world? Absolutely.
Ballymurphy can play a bigger role in terms of reconciliation. So if you look at the Ballymurphy community, long before the physical violence of the parachute regiment in 1971, you had the structural violence of the state. For many decades, that was the Orange State, where you had housing discrimination, you had employment discrimination. If you look at the statistics in this, it was the highest in what they call the United Kingdom. And so you had the structural violence, and John Gultang is a Norwegian sociologist who I'm a big fan of, and he talks about the triangle of violence. You had the physical, the structural, which I've described, and then the cultural violence, which is the misinformation, the demonisation of all of that community. So this is a community which had a very poor interface with the justice system. And what the Ballymurphy inquest done, which is much bigger than just the legal vindication of those innocent people, and that was all the right thing to do. But that community then could have a confidence in the justice system, and that's much bigger. That's about reconciliation. So where you have people encouraging young people in particular to look at alternatives to the justice system, you can argue forcibly that the justice system works. And you can point the examples. In Ballymurphy, you can point to a very particular example. And I think that's key. When I was growing up, that was a much more difficult job. When I started out in this journey as a lawyer doing these type of cases, it was difficult to convince families that you could down this road and you could get a result. And now we have clear, identifiable examples of that, and I think that has a much bigger role in terms of reconciliation and peace building in this community.
Yeah. So we've looked just there as well at, I suppose, attempts to disrupt judicial process. And just, I'm wondering about your opinion on maybe recent challenges to, the rule of law that we've spoken on here before about, and also here about the Good Friday Agreement as well. Various challenges posed to that. I know you have commented on it previously in terms of the internal market a couple of years back, but where are we now with that, do you see, in terms of access and justice and making sure that remains a robust mechanism for us?
Yeah, I'm often asking, I think it was maybe something you might raise with me, would I encourage young people to go into law? And I was at this position at one point, and on many occasions you'll have small victories and larger defeats, and especially during the conflict here, it was a very difficult time, much more difficult than it is now. We've made great ground in terms of the broadening jurisprudence, human rights jurisprudence. The European Court obviously played a key role in that. And if you look around the world, and even in Palestine, the Israeli courts, weren't really a strong forum for legal activism, but you still had some good results around travel permits and land rights for Palestinians. The same in Chile, where there was tens of thousands of victims of torture and murder by the state. You still had these examples of legal cases winning, where people's execution was stayed and things like that. So very often lawyers work in an arena where they only get small victories and much larger defeats, and it can be very, very difficult at times. But that, there's always hope.
Yeah.
It's always a potential site for social change, for legal victories then that'll obviously impact on society. So I would always encourage people that, despite all of those, the arc of history, to say, bends, but I don't think it's quite clear that sometimes you take a step back, you might take two forward, and it can be frustrating, but we still have to keep at it and still have faith that, and have an optimism about the rule of law, a stubborn optimism about the rule of law. And as a acquaintance of mine, Albie Sachs, the former constitutional judge in South Africa, who was appointed by Mandela, I worked with him in the Colombian peace process, and I've had him over to West Belfast for the festival as well. He always talks about we need to realign the rule of law with justice, and that's always a battle.
Yeah.
You'll have good days, you'll probably have more bad days, but you just got to got to chip away, work away, and when those victories come, you got to think of the next one. You got to move on.
Yeah.
Bank it and move on to the next, because there'll always be other cases, other causes you need to be working on.
So, it's clear from your work that there's a really strong emphasis on your community, and I don't just mean in the sense of your local community, which you're very much a part of, and it informs your work and just the way you work in general, but also in a wider context. And I'm just wondering, just your work, how does that contribute to, equality and the promotion of equality and justice, maybe outside of legal practice, within the community? I know you've a few initiatives that you've been working on yourself, outside of, the day-to-day legal work.
Yeah, I'm involved in, probably at one point involved in too many, different community organisations. I've done work with the local residents around resolution of issues, where Clonard's in an interface area. We've had issues with parades and stuff in the past, so I've done work around that. I do a lot of other work in the community with a local festival, trying to promote a community that was demonised during the conflict, trying to promote a better image of that community, bring in international speakers to into West Belfast and shine a light on it, and also promote local people as well. Yeah. I think it's, as lawyers, it's an arena for activism, but that isn't just in the court. It's not just in the office. I think, once we go out there, and we're very lucky in West Belfast, we've had a lot of examples, the PJ McGrory's and the Oliver Kellys and people, Pat Finnegan's, people who preceded me, were fearless advocates for this community, and there's a real vibrant, respect for human rights and the work that we're doing within our community. So that's all to be welcome. And
I know you're a great sportsman. Do you think that your involvement with football and sports really feeds into that? Is that part of the
Absolutely. I'm involved in underage teams and currently managing St. Gal's senior football team. My playing days are over,
right?
Regrettably, but I'm too old and too slow. So I've transformed that onto the coaching and the GAA. Absolutely, you'll know that from being a Newry resident as well. The GAA plays an absolutely massive role in the communities all over Ireland. Your local GAA club, you're christened there.
Yeah.
You might even have your communion there, your birthdays, your 18th, your 21st. Some of you might even have your wedding reception, and you'll be playing bingo there when you're a pensioner. I mean, everything evolves around the GA club, and I think it's a great thing we have. We're very unique in the world to have such a strong sporting and cultural organisation with is at the heart of our community. So yeah, I enjoy that work, and I'm married to a St. Gall's woman as well. I'm actually the only person in the house not playing football at the minute. My wife's playing for Gaelic for Mothers, so wow. I'm feeling a wee bit left out.
Yeah, you'll have to pick that up again.
No, I think I'm too old for that. But yeah, it's a big part of my life and my family's life, and I think I have to say we're very lucky to have the GA.
Absolutely. And I suppose you did touch on it there, and about people getting involved in this type of work. But just for listeners who are, and I know that a lot of the people listening to this podcast, that's one of the things they're really interested in, lawyers who have experience in their journeys and finding out how they got into law. But do you have any practical advice or tips for anybody who would like to get into this area of law, or anybody who feels, passionate about something and wants to use law, not necessarily to qualify as a solicitor, for example, but want to use that arena to maybe let their voice be heard and represent others?
Yeah, I mean, I often get emails almost on a weekly basis in relation to this, people who want to come and as much as possible to try to bring people in for work experience. Yes. So the first advice we would give them is get experience. And they're not many, but there are a number of offices who are doing this human rights work. Try and it's not always easy. Try and get some experience doing the legacy work, human rights work. Try other areas of law as well. You might find that they enjoy other bits and pieces, and it's attractive to employers when you have experience of a wide range of law, and that might be the way in. What I would say is it's hard work. It's not always lucrative, but it isn't a sacrifice. I mean, I was doing a recent interview with Albie Sachs, I've mentioned earlier, and I talked about, he was a lawyer who represented many ANC members during the conflict. He was a white South African. He could have had a privileged life as a white man, a lawyer in apartheid South Africa. He chose the difficult route, and he eventually was detained and in solitary confinement for a long period of time. He then had to leave South Africa and was lecturing in Mozambique, and he lost an arm in an undercar explosion. So there was someone there who got involved in this type of work, who made many sacrifices for it. And I put this question to him in an interview for Fela just a month or two back, and I asked him, was the sacrifice worth it? And his answer was very, it left me stunned, to be honest. And he said, well, it wasn't a sacrifice. He says, not at all. I got to meet great people. I got to do work that I loved. It would have been a sacrifice if I didn't do it. I would have sacrificed my soul. So, when young people like that who are deeply passionate about it, you often hear people saying, well, you're going to have to sacrifice. I don't think it's a sacrifice at all. I think it's the right move. If that's the kind of work that you love, if you can find a labour of love, it's very, very important in your life, and it happens to be this type of work, then I would encourage that. You will have, it is difficult, the institute, to get into the institute. You get a law degree, first of all, to get into the institute. You'll have knockbacks to get the right office. You might have to take it won't be a straight line. You may have to take a longer route, but just stick at it. And because the key thing is passion. You mentioned the word passion. It's the absolutely key thing. And don't be deterred from that. And hopefully you'll find the right place, the right work you're doing. And if you carry that passion into your work, then you'll be successful at it.
Fantastic. Well, look, that was absolutely fantastic advice. I'm sure people will find your story and your journey there so interesting. So thank you so much for joining us today.
No, glad to be here.
And we look forward to checking in again with you soon, hopefully.
No problem.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service, where our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.